He's Howard Eibach, a former copywriter and creative director and the author of 2 books on the creative brief.
And he's Henry Gomez, an ad agency strategist with 26 years of experience. And together, we're the Brief Brothers, having an ongoing conversation about creative briefs, briefing, and advertising. We're back with another episode, Henry. Today we have Faris Yakob, who is half the partnership with his wife, Rosie, of Genius Steals. These guys have been on the road for the last 9 or 10 years. They are vagabonds, constantly on the road teaching strategy, creativity, how to think differently, all grounded in the creative brief. And Faris was gracious enough to give us some time. He's in Mexico City. So let's join the conversation now. Everyone. All right, Henry, we are exactly. We are back for another episode, and we have a guest who lives on the road. He and his wife, Rosie, live on the road, and today they're joining us from Mexico City in the wonderful, beautiful country of Mexico. This is Faris Yakob. Have I said your name correctly, Faris?
Yeah, that'll do. I mean, that sounds good to me.
Okay. Well, I want to make sure it's right. Faris is a unique creature of our industry. It's kind of hard to describe what he's done, because he began his career on the agency and consulting side, and was joined by his wife, has also worked in the agency world as strategists and creatives and innovative thinkers in some of the coolest agencies on the planet. And he's worked all over the world. And he and his wife, Rosie, now have graduated to this constantly on the road existence that only a handful of human beings could actually do. I think the rest of us dream about it, but he's actually doing it. And he is an acknowledged industry thought leader in strategy, innovation, thinking, creativity, and of course, the creative brief. I had the pleasure of taking his webinar hosted by Wark, and he'll tell us a little bit more about all of this as we get started. So, Faris, welcome to the Brief Brothers. We're delighted to have you.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation. It's very nice to be here.
Why don't we start with you telling us a little bit about how did you get to where you are today? I mean, if someone had told you 5 or 10 years ago that you'd be living and teaching and working on the road, would you have believed it?
No, I don't think so. No. Like everything, it looks like a straight line from looking backwards, but it was very circuitous along the route. But no, I never had any particular appetite for running my own business. I just kept finding myself not being happy in every large corporate entity that I ended up being in. And I kept trying to go to bigger ones to see if I could address the problems at scale. And that didn't really suit me. But yeah, I can sort of give a little bit of a history. Very kind to say that I'm an industry thought leader. I guess that means something. But part of the way that I do everything is that I think with writing primarily, and I write. Historically, I wrote a lot. I blogged every day for a good 10 years about advertising, and now I write a monthly column or 2 monthly columns, which sort of compresses some of that stuff. But I guess I started out in management consulting, which I mention only because there is strategic and intellectual rigor to that industry, despite kind of it being in some ways kind of it's kind of, consulting generally is where lots of smart people go because they pay a lot of money and it's not skill specific, right? So a lot of people with goodish degrees that are not vocational end up in consulting, particularly from my university, because they offer just more money and they sort of scoop up people who like thinking and then deploy them in different places, and you pick up useful skills. I got to be a management consultant during a very strange period of history, 1999, 2000, 2001, where my company would take vast sums off blue chips and then invest those sums in startups to try and, become multi-billion-dollar incubator back in the late 90s. Now, when I started, I immediately had share options worth millions of dollars, and everything was going extremely well. And I found it like being an adult seemed to be very easy. I just got into the technology revolution without even trying. Now, obviously, when the crash happened and the company collapsed and everything went away, I began to develop some good lessons, and I started to think about what I wanted. And a couple of things had happened. One, which is I wanted to work in music or in writing. And so I went to do some internships at magazines, ended up writing advertorial copy for Maxim magazine in the UK because none of the journalists would touch it because it's toxic. You can't write advertising, disgusting. The church and state was much more separate in the late 90s than I think it probably is now, but there's still that sort of sense of it, I think. But when I tried magazines and I tried record labels, there was very little intellectual rigor. There was very little thinking. It's very much about how things are done and hustle and relationships and stuff. And I have sort of an academic approach to things to some degree. So I needed something that was slightly more rigorous. But I didn't really know what, because I didn't love the culture of consulting, the suit wearing thing, the sort of pretending to be smarter than everybody thing. Like you're 21 years old and you're telling CEOs how they should, build their company around this new thing called 3G, which was always kind of a little bit funny. I'm just trying to get this sunlight off my face. Okay, well, that was it. That's much worse. Okay. So, but one of the things that happened, I don't know what to do about that. That's fine. Well, I'll just have this on my face. It's fine. One of the things that happened during this period that I was getting to play with agencies because we were starting companies and we had a bunch of incubation companies inside this company. And because of that, I got to brief brand consultancies and ad agencies. And I went to a meeting at FCB when they had their offices on the King's Road. And it was the most extraordinarily OTOs, grandiose, luxurious office I'd ever seen in my life. And I was like, what is this? How does this work? How do they have so much money? Anyway. So, but that didn't lead me straight into advertising. I was still looking for something balancing, I suppose, my need to think rigorously in some fashion and my desire to work in the creative industry and wear trainers to work. And I ended up applying for a graduate scheme at OMD, the media agency, because I wanted to learn a thing. Because advertising, education in the UK is non-vocational. Higher education is primarily academic. You don't do a vocational degree. If you did an ad degree in the UK, when I was doing it, you wouldn't probably get a job at the good ad agencies. They wouldn't hire from schools that offered vocational degrees because of the kind of classist separation between university and polytechnic. Now that's changed, I'm sure, in the last 25 years. But at the time, we used to joke about it. You'd never get a job at a good agency with an ad degree. Now, postgraduate schools are a really important part of how the industry has stopped training people because it costs money. So now you have portfolio schools and ad schools and masters in brand and center and that kind of thing. So that's how I got into it, and I learned some, I guess, basic training craft, media planning, but I got pretty frustrated pretty quickly with it, and then found my way into a company called Naked, which sat in between non-obvious creativity, bit like strategy consulting, comms planning, channel planning, and sort of integrated strategy, kind of trying to patch over the massive fissure in the industry that opened up when media and creative separated into two different systems with different business models, different priorities, different approaches to thinking. And that kind of was problematic. And equally, at the same time, early 2000s, a lot of new channels were emerging. The internet was becoming a thing. People were thinking outside of the standard TV, print, outdoor radio. They were thinking in terms of experiential and ambient and various other forms of non-traditional creativity that they didn't have agencies that did that yet. And so we got to do a lot of that work as well because we were like inventing media as we went, So I did that in London, Sydney, New York, ended up kind of as the head of digital to some degree. Naked was quite a fluid, flat place. And then from there, ended up as the chief digital officer of McCann Erickson in New York. They recruited me and offered me a lot of money, and it seemed like a good idea to go to a traditional agency because I thought I wanted to have breadth. The key thing I've always looked for is new experiences, not the same thing in different places. So I thought media is good. Naked is a hybrid. I need some experience at a creative agency. I need experience at a digital agency. I need experience at a media company. I need experience, with client. I need to have all those pieces in my head so I can understand the whole, what I call the creative industrial process. And the through line that we use to talk to all the pieces of that is the brief. It's the sort of the red thread that connects the entire process together, from clients have a problem and some money all the way through to the media agency briefing Facebook and or whoever else to get the media ideas at that end of the system, right? Then it's this thread that holds the whole thing together. And so we use it to talk about not just the brief and the briefing, which are really important, but also how that process works through different companies and rosters and geographies, and timeframes. And as I said, breadth is important to me because one of the things I noticed, especially in America, is that most people who are clients have always been clients and have never worked in an agency. Most creatives have never been a planner. Most agency people have never changed agency disciplines. If you're creative, you're creative. If you're media, you're media. For digital, you're digital. And that to me felt like, what's the opposite of integration? Disintegrated, I suppose.
Siloed.
Yeah, I prefer disintegrated. Yeah, but yeah, so it seemed to me that like if the issue had been for a long time integration, that the best way of being able to sort of speak to that is to have experience inside all the different parts of the system that are being integrated, perhaps. That's going on for a long time. Anyway, that was in New York. I was MDC as the Chief Innovation Officer. I set up a digital agency. I extracted myself from that situation to give myself more freedom. To America, they don't like it when you take vacations very much. They get kind of confused. They're like, why do you not care? And I'm like, about what? But so I didn't like that aesthetic. And I make this joke a lot, but it's not a joke. One of my board level engagements in New York, our board meetings were on Sundays every week because we were so busy in the week with meetings. We couldn't have meetings except on Sundays. And I was just like, really? I don't think that seems, I mean, is that really necessary? I don't know. So yeah, 9 years ago, in about a week and a half, we packed up our stuff, removed ourselves from our jobs, liquidated the equity we had, and went out on the road, became fully nomadic, and then set up a company in which we do a number of different scales of consulting engagement with clients, agencies, media companies, media trade bodies, and that kind of thing.
Well, until you had actually said the words, the creative brief is the thread, the through thread for everything, I wasn't quite sure you were going to say something like that. Now I know what it is that you and Rosie do, but because one of the, Henry and I talk about this from time to time, that the brief in some creative circles is kind of a, it's an old school kind of a thing, and people love to diss the brief and, refer to it as, it's ancient, and what can we do differently? And yet, our perspective is no, this is the first step of the creative process. And if you get it wrong here, everything else falls apart. When you're out on the road, well, that's kind of redundant because you are there all the time, but when you're out consulting and training and teaching, what is the perception what's the one thing that you hear the most from the people you work with about the creative brief and maybe the headache? What's the key thing?
So it's a number of things, I think, but to your point, it tends to be like creatives will say we never get any good briefs, and they'll say it's not single-minded enough, the insight isn't very insightful, there's no budget, there's no time. And the planner will say creatives never read the brief properly or even pay attention. They just look for the proposition and then go off and do what they're going to do anyway. And part of that is, so what we do in that area is we do empathy exercises. We'll do workshops with creatives and make them write briefs. And we'll do workshops with planners and make them write lines. Just to demonstrate that those other person's job in this system is really, really hard. That writing a brief is hard, writing a proposition is really hard. Writing something that's not generic, but is also not too directional that the creatives get angry is extremely hard. And equally, for a creative, having a blank page as your everyday kind of thing and expecting 95% of the things you come up with to never get made is hard. And emotionally, it's extremely complex. That's why creatives often get a little bit fragile, because there's a lot of rejection. One of our friends is a creative director, and she said the thing is that planners, it's a shame that it's incumbent upon planners to do this, but it is. Planners have to make friends with the creatives, and I mean that socially. I mean that going out afterwards. I mean making the effort to go and turn up at their things, even if they don't want you, which is often the way because they're quite cliquey sometimes. Not to generalize, but it can be. And the reason for that is because otherwise you only see you twice. I see you once to get work from you, and once to find out why it's wrong, and that doesn't make me like you. And I'm like, I can see how that would be the case, In terms of the thing, like historically, yes, the creative brief has been relatively static in its thing for 40 or so years. Now, there's been some evolution, and the workshop that I think you saw is one of our most popular workshops and gigs and training pieces called Beyond Boring Briefs, where we have like 50 years of creative briefs from some of the best agencies in the world. And we just go through them and look at why they're the same and why they're different. And the thing isn't about them being old necessarily, it's about being them fit for purpose. Because there is a lot of assumptions built into what a brief is, about what advertising is, how it works, and what agencies are for. So the very earliest briefs all have a message thing, right? There's an idea of message transmission is the important thing that a brief does. This is the key message. Tell it interestingly enough that it's fun advertising, but once you get that message in someone's head, it will make them buy our product. Now, that comes across really strongly in like the idea of propositions and USPs, right? So Rossa Reeve invented this concept of a USP. I think unique seems a bit of a push in a world of parity products. Like all products are parity now, like give or take at the same price points. And even then, I don't think USPs really exist, but I do think you can have a point of view. And so Paul Feldwick and Robert Heath at the University of Bath wrote a good white paper called 50 Years of the Wrong Model, the messaging myth. How the message is basically irrelevant. It's how you say something that creates the engagement emotionally, which circumvents rational decision making, which leads to price premiums and creates growth. That the message is probably not that important. But whilst we sort of know that, you still have to have a proposition, because otherwise creatives don't know what to do.
Yeah, that's I call it the MacGuffin, right? It's a form of, everybody's chasing it. It's the thing that everything is organized around, and you need to have it. Otherwise, there's no reason to do anything. Mm-hmm. But it's not the most important thing. The story around it is what's important.
100%. And you know, his point is that the chimpanzees and the PG Tips commercials, like they didn't say anything about tea that was non-generic. Tea, refreshing, tea, whatever it is. It wasn't a unique point of view about tea. It was a unique creative treatment that people fell in love with, you know. But having said that, the earliest versions of briefs were written when the only outputs possible were scripts and billboards and whatnot, right? And I think it's fair to say if you're briefing in a database-driven functional website, that what you need to tell people is probably going to be different than what you need to do to write a 30-second script. I think they're just different asks. And like some stuff will be the same. The brandy stuff probably will be similar. But like a website doesn't have a message in the same way as a 30-second piece of communication does. An experience or an event doesn't. And lots of agencies have, in the last 5 years, aggressively moved into experience design as Accenture kind of came in from the other side, right, into the industry, because it's a kind of new pivot on what digital is, a more deeply integrated form of digital, I suppose, that keeps you kind of but yeah, I do think so. We would always say that different jobs require different kinds of briefs, and that's fine. Just change the brief so it includes the things you need it and not the things you don't.
A couple of weeks ago, we had as a guest Cameron Day, who was the son of Guy Day, founder of Chiat Day, and he's got a new book out called Chew with Your Mind Open. And he made a point of saying that he doesn't, it's actually a line from a billboard campaign he did for Central Market here in Austin, featuring fruits or vegetables that looked like organs of the human body.
Okay.
So the line with that was, the line Chew with Your Mind Open was associated with a piece of fruit or a vegetable that looked like the human brain. In any event, he made a point of saying in our interview with him that he doesn't believe in parody products, that he's the intrepid digger, the intrepid anthropologist who looks for the tidbit that separates one product from another. I don't imagine that would be fruitful if you're trying to distinguish Coke from Pepsi. But he shared a story that I uncovered years ago and wrote about it in my first book called The Capodastro Bar. Are you familiar with that story? Mm-mm. It's an old story about a copywriter who works for an agency who's just landed as its piece of business a piano manufacturer, and he's dissatisfied with all the information he's learned from the marketing folks and the product folks. So he asked his creative director, "Can I go for the factory tour?" So he gets in a bus and goes, and he meets an old craftsman, 90 years old, who's been there forever, who's says, oh, what distinguishes our piano from the others is this thing called the capodastro bar, which actually doesn't do anything in the piano until the piano is 50 years old, when something inside of it begins to warp. And the capodastro bar prevents this warping from taking place. Therefore, the piano is the most prized possession of orchestras and opera houses, and he finds a non-parity issue. Yeah. So I'm just wondering, when you do put together a brief, have you given up? Are you looking for something that distinguishes one product or service from another, or?
So it's a very Ogilvy way of thinking, right? Ogilvy would say interrogate the product until it, gives up its truth or something like that to that effect. I think when Ogilvy was writing ads, that may have been true. I think with artisanal craftsmanship products like the 50-year-old belly band that supports the piano from warping, sure. I think if you have a luxury item which people are willing to pay a vast amount of money for purely based on brand, then you need to sort of spin out these stories to provide provenance and kind of some kind of substantiation to the extraordinary cost of things. But I think it's different for most products. And I think the amount of thought that goes into buying CPG products is almost zero. It's just like most stuff is bought on impulse based on what you bought last week. Like almost inevitably, if you shop in the same way that we think people shop, which they don't anymore, but if you're a weekly shop where the mum goes and buys the weekly groceries, that will repeat itself very naturally. And there's loads of data that shows that, right?
I hear Byron Sharp.
Yeah, I mean, something like that, right? Market share is pretty predictable for those reasons. But like, there's a lot of that. I think there are differences, and part of the job is to highlight distinctive things. Yeah, there's Byron Sharp in that too. But distinctiveness makes sense, right? You want to stand out in some fashion because the job of creativity is to make something stand out. You want to solve problems, sure, but the problem that advertising solves is how to grow with the least amount of media money. That's the job of creativity. That's what it does. Because if you just have enough money, you can basically force growth by making yourself famous enough, right? But it's harder and harder to do that because we live in a fragmented culture where media is fragmented, and therefore culture is fragmented. Therefore, what's famous now is not what famous was when we were growing up. When we were growing up, famous meant everybody knew the Rolling Stones or the Beatles or Nirvana, let's say. Now, everybody knows nothing of the same thing apart from maybe we went to war today. You know what I mean? Like that, maybe everybody knows right now. But apart from that, most things are hugely fragmented. If you ask, boomers who BTS is, I imagine most of them won't be able to tell you. And that's fair enough, but they don't care. But it means that what famous is different. And it means it's much harder to make something famous just with advertising. I think, there used to be reliability issues and quality control issues, but now most products don't kill you. And when they do, they get recalled. Most cars don't break down. Most cars look exactly the same, frankly. Most cars are silver, black, or white. Very, very few, like the vast majority of cars are those three colors now. They tend to be extremely self-similar, and they differentiate with the face, if you're a car. The grille and the face and the eyes, that's how you kind of differentiate. And having worked with a bunch of car manufacturers, they're very aware that the face is a hugely important driver of preference. If you don't like the face, you aren't going to buy the car, But are these unique selling propositions? No, they're just hints of difference, right? They're shades. And I would if you find a genuine difference based on something like, quality or craftsmanship or longevity or not built-in obsolescence, then amazing, talk about it. But I imagine most companies think in 2-year replacement cycles. They don't want the phone to last forever. They don't build it that way. They don't want a car to last forever. They don't want your washing machine to last forever because that's not good for continually selling them again and again. So in general terms, I think the difference we look for and exaggerate and amplify needs to be noticeable and interesting. I don't think it comes often from a pure product claim anymore.
Yeah, I think Howard is single-handedly trying to make the Capodastro bar famous because I think this is the 4th episode in a row we talk about it. But to me, the part of that story, and we haven't really talked about it that much, but what you were saying to me, I started thinking, yes, maybe there's a truly product differentiating aspect is other pianos don't have the Capodastro bar. But the reality is that for most piano buyers, that's irrelevant because they're not going to have the piano for 50 years. So it's not about the Capodastro bar. It's about what the Capodastro bar says about the brand and the story that you can forge around a manufacturer that would put in a part that wouldn't take effect for 50 years. So going back to that idea of a MacGuffin, right? That it's just emblematic of something that we want to say that's distinctive about this brand.
100%. And Ogilvy was the master of this kind of thing, right? Ogilvy's very famous Rolls-Royce ad at 60 miles an hour, the loudest thing is the clock. Okay. First of all, that's a direct copy of an earlier car ad. It's the exact line. He just copied the exact line. It's completely derivative, like everything is ultimately. But that was a particularly serious lift. Secondly, have you ever been in old cars? You ever been in a car from the 50s and 60s?
I have a 66 Dodge.
Is the
not in a while, but yeah.
Is the engine super quiet? Is the engine famously quiet? No. Yeah. Do you think it's likely that a 60s Rolls Royce, the engine is less loud than the ticking clock in the dashboard? No, it's not likely at all. It's impossible, in fact. But to your point, he does it for a reason. He's using it as to your point, to tell a story about how much care, because all Rolls Royces are handmade, right? That's part of their thing. Every single one is handmade. So he's talking about a story of handmadeness, right? In cars, which is all about manufacturing and Model Ts and the manufacturing line at the time, especially, that was the big innovation, right? So he's pushing back against that and talking about craftsmanship with something which is both stolen and clearly untrue. But it works really well as an ad.
I gave a talk to the Miami Ad School and then again recently to some students from Florida State University, and I brought up this whole debate about differentiation versus distinctiveness. And it seems like on the surface, right, like you basically have a Birnbach who's saying it's not what you say, it's how you say it. And you have Ogilvy who's quoted as saying it's not how you say it, it's what you say. I mean, he's literally quoted as that. But to me, it's not an unfair characterization of Ogilvy, because if you think about another campaign that he's famous for is the Hathaway Shirts campaign.
Yeah.
And there's nothing there about differentiation of the product. This is literally the poster child of distinctiveness. Like, get attention. They used this guy with the eye patch on for no reason.
Yeah.
It just got your attention, and suddenly, and it sold a shitload of shirts.
Yeah.
So
I agree. So there's a couple of bits, right? One, which is anytime you get these binaries, it's like Ogilvy versus Birnbach thing. A couple of things to keep in mind. Ogilvy wrote a lot of stuff that directly contradicts other things he wrote.
Yes.
He liked writing jokes, basically. He wrote a lot of jokes, and a lot of those jokes are about advertising on the advertising industry, in my opinion. He also was a door-to-door salesman who wrote a guide to how to sell for door-to-door salesmen for the AGA, and he based his initial thinking around advertising on knocking on the door and that experience, right? So We Sell or Else is inherently direct response. It's not brand building, etc. It's a misunderstanding of how advertising works, in my opinion, completely. But the important thing to remember with everything Birnbach and Ogilvy said is they're not scientists or researchers or dispassionate pundits. They are copywriters trying to convince you that their agency is the most effective agency available. So everything they write is advertising for their agency. And Ogilvy was saying, trust us. We know that the bottom line matters, hard selling, sell or else, because he thought clients wanted to hear that, because he thought that would help him sell Ogilvy to his clients. And Birnbach was the same. Birnbach wrote the memo originally at Gray about how we must forge our own path forward, which ended up being DDB. He wasn't a cultural philosopher. He was a copywriter who was writing stuff to make his agency that was brand new famous enough to get big clients. Everything that anybody who works for an agency writes for their agency is advertising. And so we should always think about it in that sense. In the same way that whenever a CEO says anything at all, that's advertising. A CEO's job is in America primarily, but globally because of it, is to maintain share price. Everything they say can affect share price. Therefore, everything they say is salesmanship. You can't take it seriously. You have to assume they are just trying to push up their share price all the time.
Well, you bring up an interesting phenomenon, because I think that this is, it's a frequent topic here is the lamentation of the decline of the advertising business. And I think a big part of it, you mentioned shareholders. I think in the golden age of advertising, if we're going to say the 60s and maybe into the 70s was the golden age of advertising, a lot of the companies weren't publicly held. A lot of the companies were privately held. And so an agency president was a colleague of the client owner, like the client company. And now it's all about, short-termism, the reporting to the street. The agencies have been demoted to vendors that report to the mid-level at the client rather than the CEO speaking to CEO. That's true. But back to the distinctiveness versus differentiation, we also talked about with one of our previous guests about the famous, it's recognized maybe the best ad campaign of all time, the Think Small and Volkswagen under Bernbach, and talking about the car was truly differentiated, right? Like the Volkswagen car at that time, and the copy speaks to that differentiation. If you read the copy, it's long copy for the Think Small ad. It's all about how different the car is, but it definitely is distinctive because it's very different to what other car advertising at the time was. Car advertising in the late 50s, right, was illustrated. It was a lot of puffery involved. It wasn't very matter of fact. It wasn't. And so all of a sudden you have this advertiser that's talking to you as a peer and using a little tongue in cheek and a little bit of, clever, witty irony and that's made it very distinctive. So I don't think there's one way to slice the pie or whatever. There's different elements that you can bring. If you have true differentiation, great. But I think you can always make a brand distinctive, and that's a great thing to be. As Mark Ritson says, first maybe it was Sharp, but first you must know it's me, right? Like say something in a way that you're not going to confuse me for somebody else.
The distinct things, the first of advertising is to be recognizable, and then ideally, that's why they have distinctive assets and all that kind of thing. If you don't recognize it being from a brand, it's probably not going to have much of impact. It's kind of like a non-viewable impression. They don't have much impact because nobody sees them, so they're not real. But I agree, there's no one size fits all, which is one of the frustrating things about anything to do with creative work and the fact we live in a complex world. We say something like, we like tools and not rules. Because if you give people rules, then they'll just follow them until they keep making mistakes because they've got to a use case where the rules don't apply. If you give them tools and say, use the tools as and when you need them based on what situation you're facing, right? So to your point, if you've got a brand new product in a brand new category, let's say when the iPhone launched or whatever, I don't know, something new, you can talk about all the new things it does until it gets copied endlessly, which it will. And the copying cycle is faster and faster. Any innovation in terms of camera or whatever the thing does will be imitated within the next year cycle, right? That will just happen. So it's not a defensible thing to differentiate based on features because they will always be imitated. So I guess the distinction, and I find it a little bit facile and semantic to some degree, but differentiation as a sort of abstractive, like in a Trout way, Jack Trout's version of it is kind of conceptual differentiation. Where does it fit in the quadrant of the planning map? Young versus old versus modern versus heritage, whatever, right? And the distinctive thing is like, does it have colors, shapes, sounds, words that are uniquely associated with that product or brand? Which I do have some appetite for because it does help when thinking about, we do work in this area with a bunch of brands at the moment, creative effectiveness, what leads to more effective advertising, and the advice that you get from all the research wisdom that we have, evidence-based and so on, is somewhat generic, and it has to be emotional, has to be distinctive, has to be deeply linked to the brand, it has to be novel or interesting or stand out or get attention in some way, and it has to be considered over the long term and the short term, which is cool. All that stuff makes sense. So does it tell you how to make ads that are good, though? No, not really. It tells you that these certain elements tend to appear in ads that tend to work the best.
Yeah.
But you can also break all the rules. and still be very effective if you understand context better. And the obvious example that comes to mind is the Coinbase ad. The rules for emotional brand building advertising is to have people interacting, to have humans, to have story, incident, place, to have jokes, to have wordplay, to have all the right brain things according to Lemon and Lookout thinking, right? The Coinbase ad does none of those things. But arguably, because the Super Bowl had 70+% of the ads were celebrity filled jokes, basically, no one's talking about any of those because there's too many of them to remember any of them. So they don't stand out. So each of those ads could have been good by itself, but in the context of the Super Bowl, they're not good because they're the same as every other really expensive celebrity comedy ad. So don't do what everyone else does is usually a good place to start.
You bring up an interesting thought, and to me it's interesting because you said you started out in management consulting, right? Which because of its rigor, right? That it was a very rigorous
and they pay a lot of money.
And they pay a lot of money, but I think the point is what you have in a lot of marketing departments in clients across the world are people that are trying to create some sort of rigor in a process of creativity, which by definition is organic, it's iterative, to your point, if you zig when other people are zagging, that could work. There's this idea of we're going to find the magic bullet, the formula, right?
Yeah.
And that we're gonna once we have that magic formula, then creating the ads will just be a function of following the formula. And I think it gets back to Bill Bernbach, rules are what the artist breaks. And in a certain way, there is artistry involved in advertising because this is all a very subjective thing.
Yeah, I mean, so 100%. Rules are what the artist breaks is good, but they have to know the rules before they can break them. So good artists learn to draw and become good draftsmen, and then they go conceptual if they choose to because they've learned how the rules work. You don't just get to jump straight to the rule breaking stage. I think that's kind of just like you didn't learn your craft. You didn't learn how. If you don't know the history of how we think advertising works, then you're not doing a service to your clients, right? In some part of your system, there needs to be somebody involved, a strategist, a planner, somebody who has done the research, who is applying whatever rigor is possible to apply. That said, to your point, obviously the creative process is what Wydens would call organized chaos. That's why agencies exist, though, isn't it, right? So the first agency, well, not the first agency, but McCann, when it span out of, McCann was ExxonMobil's marketing department, and it span out of ExxonMobil in 1903, and then it got turned into the IPG thing. But McCann is like a very old agency because it was spun out of a corporate. And with the whole discussion around in-housing now, there's lots of different vectors occurring. But the thinking behind it was they'll be better at doing the organized chaos if they're not sitting inside a massive manufacturing measurement system, which is what a large corporation is. Highly linear, highly logical, highly left brain, highly analytical, highly measured, all of which you have to do. Manufacturing is not organized chaos. Manufacturing is very low variance. You want manufacturing to be exactly the same every single time you make a car. Creativity is the opposite of that, very high variance. You want different ads every single time you brief for creative, right? So managing that is very hard inside a corporation where the dominant culture is extremely rigid and measured, which is why agencies sort of exist. But they have to find a way to interface. Traditionally, it's the job of the planner, right, to translate the left brain thinking of a marketing brief into a single page creative brief. Like the workshop you saw, we took a bunch of clients through it last year. We've done a lot of clients. And one of the clients was like, I've been working in marketing a long time. All these briefs are a single page. Is that kind of normal? Because I write very long briefs. And I'm like, yeah, I know. That's a marketing brief. But we don't give those to creatives. They wouldn't read them. And so someone in the system will condense it down into a single page. He was like, I didn't realize that. And I was like, right, well, now you know. But
this is a topic. This is a topic of much debate for me and Howard. Where and the genesis of this podcast was actually he sent me over a paper that was written by the ANA about briefing, and it puts forth the proposition that the brief should be collaborated on by the client and the agency, and so and and I said, you know, good in theory, horrible in practice, because the people that write the briefs and the client side don't think the way creatives do. And that's my job, is to take all of this business information. And it's not just because I'm a planner, because I might be an account. Somebody, like you said earlier, somebody at the agency has to do it. Whether it's you call that person a planner, whether that person is a creative, whether that person is an account person, it doesn't matter. But somebody has to know enough about the client's business world and go wade through all of the 10-page client brief to get down to what the creatives really need to solve the creative problem. So I'm kind of, it's funny that you mentioned that paradigm, because I'm, you know, my preference is not to share my brief with the client if I can get away with it. And let them be wowed by the great creative work and take the credit in the background.
So I agree.
Faris, and I'm just going to say, before you react to that, I just want to add what I encounter in my training, because I do workshops on writing briefs. The vast majority of the participants in my workshops are marketers or client side people who ask to learn how to write the creative brief. They're not even interested in writing the marketing brief. They want to know what it is that they can do to write a document that will be of value and inspiration to the creatives. So I, you know, 100%. I talk about writing a 1-page brief, and of course that's foreign to them.
So it's interesting, right? Because again, if people had experience in different parts of the system, they would understand what happens to the work when it comes in and when it goes back out. Often we'll do a presentation and then that gets merchandised up through the brand manager to the CMO, let's say, to the CEO for sign off. The CEO isn't looking at your 100-page deck of comps. Your CEO is looking at 1 page or maybe 2 slides. And if we don't think about that, we're not going to sell any work into the CEO, because you need to help the clients get those 2 slides to be really compelling. Those are the ads for the campaign. Famously, Hegarty used to say, the brief is the first ad in the campaign. My job is to make it better. And that's a certain way of thinking about briefs, which we can come to, because there's different ways of thinking about what a brief is. But to your point, sometimes it's helpful to have the client sign off on a creative brief. But it's all about the relationship. It's all about how clients, the planner, the account team, the finance people, how long the engagement is, if you want a retained relationship versus a project relationship, how deep the creatives are on that brand, are they brand new on that brand? All these things factor in how you manage the humans in the process, right?
I'm doing a lot of nodding.
Yeah, right?
Yes.
The brief is a way of managing people. It's a way of organizing things simply for complex systems to spin around, but then when things go off in lots of different directions, the brief is still there to remind you what we're doing. So the creative brief is great, but like one of the things that's often missing within the sort of strategic framework, I think, is if there's an objective, which there should be, ideally we have objectives that we're trying to achieve, right? Using creativity, and sometimes that's ads. If we have an objective, we need to know how that's being measured at the very outset. The planner's job is to find a way to measure success, as well as, you know, because if you don't have a way to measure success, you can't demonstrate what you did worked. And if you can't do that, how did you know if it was any good? And how will you get the client to give you more money, right? But like often they're like, oh, we need to do a measurement framework. I'm like, the campaign's already run. That's too late. You have to have the measurement framework before you have the brief. But because creative agencies broke away from media agencies, the numbers people went to the media place, right? Mostly. And the creative people are like, we don't like numbers. We like pictures and you know, art. So we're going to ignore the numbers. I'm like, well, you can't ignore the numbers. The clients really, really care about the numbers.
Well, hang on a sec here first, because I argue, if you look at the briefs, I'm trying to like a couple of things I want to say. I loved your workshop that I went through. I guess that what was disappointing to me was something that I faced myself, and that is you had great examples of creative brief templates, but they were all blank.
Oh yeah.
I wanted to see example, and I've been able to uncover examples of finished briefs.
Yeah.
And I found the creative that was produced from it. So I teach the brief as it was written. Now, one of the things that these briefs that I've uncovered that I think are brilliant briefs is none of them have KPIs, these measurement tactics.
It doesn't.
And I say the reason that those creative briefs didn't ask or cite a measurement tactic is because creatives don't need to know how you measure something if they haven't got the idea yet.
So I agree with you in the sense that creatives don't need to know, but the machine does. planners need to be thinking about this in advance. And also, when we brief in an ad, we have to be very clear what the objective of those ads are. The way short-term sales ads work creatively is different than the way that brand ads work. And that's something we should be very, very clear of. Ads on TV don't work the same way as in-feed pre-roll. They're just different. And we have to be very aware that different channel choices will impact kind of the efficacy and its specific efficacy of different kinds of ideas, right? You're right, though. The creatives don't need to know that specific measurement plan, but they do need to know if the client wants trial versus long-term brand building versus, you know, what are the metrics we're going to be held up against, and then how do we know something's good if we can't prove what it did, you know? And that's tricky. I get that's tricky because obviously sales data and longer term things tends to be locked up inside the machine of the client. Often it's hard, but
Faris, do you think that one of those three criteria for measurement is going to influence the creative's thinking?
Yeah, it should do, because if you want something that works short-term sales, the ad should be fundamentally different in different places than if you want something that builds brand over time. The nature of the creative should be different. The channel choices should be different. Everything they do should be different. And if that isn't clear, if they just like make some ads about tea or whatever, that's remiss on the part of the planner, in my opinion. Like, you need to know what the job of this work is to do, and you can't have more than one, as we know. Because
interestingly enough, there's a podcast out there called Tagline, maybe you've heard of it, and it explores the backstory of various famous campaigns. And the one that I'm thinking of is a campaign for Volkswagen called The Force, with a little kid dressed up as Darth Vader.
Yeah, I remember
it was 10 or 12 years ago.
2011.
And they talked to the creatives and they said, what was the brief? And the brief was, do whatever you want.
Yeah. So
that was the brief.
This comes up, right? So that was Deutsch LA, I think.
Yeah.
I got into a fight with my CCO that year because I wanted the BMW spots we were working on to get released early, and they were like, "That's not how it works, Super Bowl Faris." And then they released the Force early, and it was a huge. Anyway, whatever, doesn't matter.
Now they all get released early. So you were on the right track.
So the brief, yeah, exactly. I mean, I was just early, but the brief thing, okay. So Russell Davies, when he was the head of planning at Wyden in London, wrote this whole thing about Nike briefs, which he said, we've been working with Nike for 30 years. Their briefs to go, do something for football this summer, don't do what you did last year, go. Because they've been working together for such a long time that all that additional stuff, it's like they knew inside and out kind of the brand. They were locked together for decades of work, right? It's definitely part of it, I'm sure. And I think you can probably get to some good work without a brief. I just think you don't necessarily know if it's good.
Yeah, except the creatives they interviewed for this campaign, the guy who came up with the idea that became the Force was a freelancer who had been working on the project for like 4 days.
And that happens a lot, I feel like, because they come in with fresh eyes. The alternative to legacy institutional knowledge is coming in with naivety and freshness, right?
And I'd say working with freelancers is the moment where you need to have your best brief as a strategist, right? Because you're bringing in people that don't have all the backstory, all the background. That doesn't mean it's a 10-page brief. It's a 1-page brief still, but I always write my brief as if somebody who's never touched the business is going to touch it.
Yeah,
that's kind of what I shoot for. But I see there's kind of two underlying themes that I'm hearing from you, and one of them is to get cross-trained experience and learn how the other departments work and what they do. That's going to help you. And the other is that there's no substitute for experience. And I think what we're seeing in the decline of the industry is the exact opposite, right? We're going for younger, cheaper people that don't have any experience, and we're training them the less, and we certainly aren't cross-training them to go, learn, well, what does the media department do? What does the production department do? What's it like to be an account person? And why are they always like taking the side of the client? Like, you mentioned empathy. I think we could all do with a lot more empathy. And
100%. I mean, empathy is the key thing that we are supposed to be good at. Understanding how to pull emotional levers through creative interventions is the job of advertising. One of the things we talk about a lot in this sense is that what we're supposed to be good at as an industry is understanding people and their motivations and so on. It would make sense to my way of thinking if we applied that to how we interact with creatives, how we interact with clients. consider the motivations of the creatives versus the motivations of clients, and then try and find a bridge between them that works for both. It's using planning skills as an organizational approach, right? I think that's part of it. And I think the challenge often is a brief is many different things at once. It's either a question or it's an answer. Some people go, it's a challenge for creatives to solve, or you could say it's a solution for creatives to do the coloring in on, right? That's a different way of, that's what clients often say. The marketing department's the coloring in department, right? The big decisions are already made. The solution architecture, the connection strategy is done. Now go and make some creative. That's a different way of thinking about it. Is it a solution or is it a question? Equally, it has to both be a request for change and an inspiration. So it's both the canvas and the frame, right? It has to tell you what's wrong. You can't have, there has to be some ideas that are off brief, right? The point of a brief is to set a parameter set around going, these are the kinds of ideas that we think will work for this problem. And other kinds of ideas that are not on this brief are wrong. Unless, of course, they're so good, we go back and rewrite the brief, which is to your point about the process stuff. Yes, the workshop you saw is all neutral briefs because I need anyway. I do a proposition workshop, which is kind of more in detail, where I go through briefs that I work with Fallon, London, the Gorilla, Sony Balls, Sony Paint. I go with Wyden's briefs for Honda Gur and Cog, all of which we worked on at Naked as their comms partners. So we saw the brief evolve and sometimes get rewritten backwards based on the idea, which
I think that's okay. And Howard and I've made this point to Howard a million times. I think the biggest sin that a strategist or a brief writer can have is the sin of hubris, of saying, well, that's not in the brief, right? You have to be open to a brilliant idea and say, wow, that made me rethink the whole strategy. And I've had that happen in my career where somebody came in with something that was off the board, but buried in that was an insight that was deeper, stronger, more true, and more powerful than what I had thought of, because I'm just a human being looking at the problem. And you're another human being looking at the problem, and maybe you have a better perspective on it.
But it still works that way, though, right? Because, like, as we said before, good planners are often good copywriters. Good copywriters are often good planners. More so than I think art directors tend to be, for whatever reason, words being a certain way of thinking about humans and pictures being a different way of thinking about humans, maybe. I don't know. But, like, understanding what makes people tick emotionally is what good creatives naturally are good at. It's what good creative directors hone as their skill. I can look at something and feel a concept where there's something interesting if I'm a good creative director, right? So, even if you go backwards and rewrite the brief, to your point about the MacGuffin, the job of the brief is to start the process. If it got to the inspiration, if it got to the idea you like and you need to go back and reverse engineer the strategy to sell it, great. If you got to the idea, then the brief did its job, which was inspire the process.
If we follow the analogy, that's a plot twist.
Yeah, right, exactly. And you want it to be a bit more exciting. You know, it's not supposed to be super linear. We had this sense of collaboration, right? But to your point earlier, collaboration is not practical when you have a multi-agency roster of dozens of agencies around the world, because everybody we interview, be it producers, media companies, technologists, creatives, anybody, they say exactly the same thing. Make sure we're there from the beginning, the very first meetings, so we can help shape the thing appropriately. And I'm like, I can't have 30 agencies at every kickoff meeting. That's not going to work, right? You're all going to fight over your bottom lines and try and work out how to get more of this budget for you. When I worked at Naked, my job was to take these agencies, break up the budget into pieces that I thought were relevant for each agency, and brief them with my strategy across the different disciplines so they were all working to a singular brief, mine. But they don't get to pitch for more budget.
I want to go back to something you said very early in our conversation, because it really fascinated me, and that is you do this workshop for creatives to help them understand how difficult it is to write a brief, and you do it conversely with account folks or planners to see how difficult it is to be a creative. Mm-hmm. As a teacher myself, and Henry's a teacher as well, I can visualize, you know, the kind of exercises you might take a creative through to write the brief, because that's what we do. I'm just curious from your experience, and I don't know how often you do this workshop. What are some of the things that your creatives say? Mm-hmm. I mean, do they voluntarily take this workshop to learn how to write a brief? even though they know that's not their job.
The agency has told them that they're going to be doing it, so yeah, voluntarily is probably a stretch. But most of them seem enthused, and like we like if we're going to take 2 or 3 days of somebody's time at an agency, it's important for us to cram in a lot of important, useful stuff in that period of time, both socially and like stuff you can take away. Because a lot of the challenges are just that the departments don't talk to each other very well. They don't hang out socially. They are very tribal and cliquey because of the nature of humans. And like the sequentiality means that everybody thinks the people above them in the chain had more time and had more control over the output. And they want control because people like being in control of their own destinies and blah, 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 blah. Okay. So what I tend to show, creatives are taught a very specific way of doing briefs and ideas, right, at ad school. It's very specific. Single-minded proposition, which is the new version of a USP, but that's what they say. Single-minded proposition is the only thing they read, and it has to be, you know, single-minded and a proposition. I'm like, okay, cool. What's a proposition? I don't know what you mean. I'm like, what is it? What does that word mean? Yeah, okay. So we can start with that, which is like, it doesn't mean anything. It's a promise. Yeah, it's a promise. Kind of. So Ross Rees would say every ad must make a promise of a benefit to a consumer. That's not true. The way you formulate propositions can be extremely diverse. And the ones I listed off from the set of briefs that we have and the stuff, propositions, there's at least 5 different types of proposition that I can, you know, go through this workshop and show. And the creatives are like, oh, I didn't know you could write a proposition like that. I'm like, yeah, you can write a tension prop. You can write a consumer benefit prop. You can write a laddering prop. You can write a challenge prop, you can write a constraint prop, all of which, like the proposition for Sony's Bulls commercial, right? So when Sony was launching the Bravia line in 2006, 5-6, and Fallon London was working on the brief, and Juan Cabral was the creative mind and director of all the spots because he refused to work with anybody else. He was the copywriter, he was the creative director, he was the art director, he was the director of the movies. He was his own creative director, which is a bizarre thought, but on the award entries, he's the creative director to himself twice. Anyway, fascinating man to work with, but had a very specific vision, you know. But the idea came from a challenge, which was, okay, we're going to advertise the Bravia on TVs. The Bravia can show more colors than any TV in the world. How do we communicate more colors on, by definition, less good TV screens that can't show as many colors? So the prop was a challenge. It was like, what's a way of fixing this problem? And Juan just said, let's get 250,000 balls and tuck them down a hill in San Francisco and film it in slow motion. Which eventually they did, you know? But it wasn't like a prop like color like no other. The prop kind of grew out of that. The benefit was more colors than any other TV. The challenge was a comms challenge. How can we possibly show that on TVs that are not of the same quality? So you go metaphorical. You find a metaphor to explain it. So anyway, but so when creatives, I think whenever we do this with creatives, they have this little light moment. Because I'm like, we spend a lot of time defining propositions, defining insights. I'm like, that's not as helpful as you might think. If it inspires a good idea, it's a prop. If it inspires a good idea in a competitively differentiating way, it's an insight. And they could be anything, as long as they work. And some creatives, like, you know, the proposition, the insight could be a cake or a picture of someone carrying a pint glass. Did you see that work? There's a really good insight piece. I believe the planner was called Paula Youngblood, the group planning director at Wyden London, for a spot about London, a Nike spot about London. And the insight was a picture from the front of the newspaper during the 7/7 bombing, terrorist bombings in London, where a guy is running from an explosion, essentially, but he's still holding his pint glass because that's an extremely British thing to do. And the insight about Londoners, the line that she wrote as the insight became the line on the ad. I forget what it is. But anyway, that was a line derived from the picture. And it's like, is that an insight? Well, it worked. So yes.
All right, you know, Faris, we could go on and on. This has been a wonderful, insightful conversation, but we've had you here for almost an hour, and we truly appreciate you carving this time out to talk to us and open up your brain and give us a nice glimpse on the inside. Pretty fascinating from my perspective. topped off by your famous do.
I didn't see the back of it yet. I mean, like.
Oh, I kind of saw that when you stood up. Yeah, is that high maintenance or low maintenance?
Low maintenance. Yeah, they're natty dreads. They did themselves. They just I just sort of trim around the outside of the dreads and it's fine.
Okay. Well, Faris Yakob of Genius Steels, thank you so much for sharing your time with us at the Brief Brothers. We are grateful.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
I should probably I got 1 second to plug something. I have a newsletter.
Absolutely.
Great.
Oh yeah.
So
plug away.
Agency Genius Skills has a newsletter that goes out to 13,000 people in the industry and in marketing around the world. Comes out twice a week, one issue a week we write, one issue a week we have a guest curator from around the world that we meet in our travels because we're trying to bring diversity to the community. That's probably the easiest way to be in touch. But I'm also at Faris on Twitter. And we recently, as of this week, relaunched our School of Stolen Genius, which is a digital learning community and platform online that features content from us, content from our partners, and a monthly meetup with the community where we have a speaker based on somebody we find interesting and host a discussion and a thing. There's a Slack group for young people who like that whole Slack life in terms of that community offering. And yeah, it's a sort of an experiment in trying to take some of the high margin, high value consulting products that we sell to clients and agencies and make them in some way available to everybody individually at a very low price point. So we're pretty excited about that. The new platform just launched. It's much easier to navigate. The website is schoolofstolengene.us, right? Yeah, School of Stolen Genius, but the dot is US at the end. Anyway,
and that's all on is that all on your Genius Steels website?
GeniusSteels.co. You'll be able to get all the stuff, the newsletter, the school, my book, the various places that we put our thinking in the
Well,
world.
I'm a subscriber to your newsletter. I get that. What is it, twice a week? So I love reading your stuff. It's been you've pointed me in the direction of some pretty cool things, which I appreciate. So awesome having you. Thank you so much, and good luck to you. Stay healthy.
Thank you. Appreciate you. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Wonderful having you, and maybe someday we'll have you again because, like Howard said, we could probably go on forever. But Thank you so much for being generous with your time.
You're in Miami. You're in Austin. Hopefully, at some point, we'll be back on the road in America, and hopefully, I'll see you IRL someday.
That would be awesome. Great. Thank you so much.
Bye.
Take care. Bye. Good stuff, Henry.
Good stuff, Howard.
He's Henry Gomez.
And he's Howard Eibach. And together we're the Brief Brothers. Till next time, bye-bye.